Now, African leaders have criticised the absence of European and Western leaders at a key summit in Europe ahead of the November COP27 climate conference in Egypt. Now, Monday's meeting in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, was aimed at raising the vast funds needed for Africa's adaptation to the ravages of climate change caused by CO2 emissions from mostly industrialized nations.
Europe, the United States, and China, they are responsible for pollution and global warming. But we are on the same planet. And now they ask us to adapt, not to follow their path of pollution.
Well, rich countries and the African Development Bank have pledged about $25 billion by 2025 to boost Africa's adaptation efforts. But the continent warns that the scale of the challenges means that it's still nowhere near enough. Our Mark Perelman headed to Rotterdam for us. He tells us more.
As we enter the last stretch of negotiations before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, leaders of Africa and Europe converge here in Rotterdam to discuss the issue of climate adaptation. This is absolutely key if Africa is to fight efficiently climate change. And one of the protagonists today was the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and she claimed that free trade was not the enemy of the fight against climate change. Let's take a listen.
It is true that many people think trade contributes to the problem of carbon emissions because of the logistics of trade and other aspects of trade. And it's true, but it is also true that trade is part of the solution. And that is what is so important, that we need to look at trade differently. What can trade bring to solving decarbonization of the world? And there are several things. We strongly believe that without trade and the support of the WTO getting involved in this, efforts at adaptation will not be as efficient. Just think about it. Trade is a tool for adaptation. It is through trade that you transmit technologies, ideas and knowledge, goods and services that allow countries to adapt, to learn from best practice in one part of the world to another. Just also think of this. If you have a climate event in which half of your country is inundated, or 1/3 like Pakistan, without trade, you will not be able to take care of the needs of the people. You need to move goods from one part of the world to the other in order to be able to take care of people. So thinking about trade, it's essential to make sure it's mainstreamed into adaptation. Lastly, we talk about finance, and it's critically important. Here at the Global Center on Adaptation, we're talking about how to mobilize finance for Africa's adaptation. But there's one non-financial issue, which has to do with trade. If you have finance, but you have countries that put in export restrictions, not allowing the goods which finance can pay for to help you with adaptation to move, then you have a problem. Do you remember the pandemic? There were many countries that had resources, money, COVAX, for developing countries had money. But because of export restrictions on vaccines, countries not allowing the export of vaccines or inputs to make vaccines, people could not access these vaccines. So getting WTO members to accept that there will be little restriction, there will be freer flow of trade on things that concern climate and concern adaptation. And that is critically important. Otherwise, you will not be able to move, and it will be so much more difficult.
Right. What do you make of the financial gap? I mean, African leaders here and elsewhere have denounced the little money that's put for adaptation because of COVID, because of Ukraine. How serious of a problem is it, and why aren't Western countries more responsive?
It's a very serious problem. I think there's a serious trust deficit for the 100 billion that had been promised a long time ago. I think up to 79 billion have now been mobilized, which is good. We will see what the latest report will say at COP27, whether we'll get to the 100. But it's taking so long, and we know that that is just the beginning, just a little of what is needed. And the adaptation, financing for adaptation is not receiving as much support as mitigation. Africa, for instance, has a $40 billion gap, of which, for over the next several years, of which the Global Center for Adaptation with African leaders and the African Development Bank are trying to mobilize, and the international community, all of us, trying to mobilize 25 billion, 60% of it, to see if we can get adaptation investments strengthened. Without it, it will be extremely difficult. You know that Africa has 80% of the people at risk of being badly affected by climate change, according to the IPCC latest report. So this is a serious issue. We must put strong effort behind mobilizing the finance, and we must put strong effort in making sure that once this finance is available, we also do not restrict access to the goods and services needed for adaptation. We must allow trade to flow.
Right, as the last question, do you believe Africans are losing faith in free trade, in donor funding, and so on and so forth?
I think Africans are seeing that global solidarity is not as strong as they would like to see. It's not as strong as the promises and the talk. I think because of the multiple shocks that the world is going through, Europe is struggling with very high energy prices at the moment and worrying about the winter. Other parts of the world are struggling with their issues. And that is totally understandable. Politicians have to take care of the immediate environment. But